Well, today I wanted to continue or kind of give a sequel to a talk that I gave a few months ago in Hickory, North Carolina at Augustana Lutheran Church. It was a great conference, kind of reflecting on the Reformation, and we're in our 500th year, our big jubilee of the Reformation. The whole world is thinking about Luther and about the Reformation and the events that happened, as the historians kind of mark its beginning with the 95 Theses in 1517. So I was asked, it was a great conference, and I was asked, if the Reformation, was it a revolution? And it was a really a fun topic to talk about. And especially again, this is one of those times in our history when we're reflecting on what does it mean to be Lutheran. And of course, the Reformation is always associated with Luther because it began with the 95 Theses. So it was an interesting question. I did a Google search, and you can do this if you take Luther and revolution, the two words Luther, like the name Luther, and the word revolution, and you Google them, you get about 13.6 million hits. So that's pretty interesting, isn't it? There's an overwhelming consensus that the Reformation was indeed a revolution. Secular historians, they really do see the Reformation as a touchstone in history, kind of a watershed moment when things changed drastically in world history. So, secular historians certainly do see the Reformation as a revolutionary event. The Roman Catholic Church, they certainly do see the Reformation as revolutionary. They see Martin Luther kind of as a Benedict Arnold, Judas Iscariot figure. Not all Roman Catholics do, but I mean just in terms of church history for them, Luther betrayed the church and started his own church. He was a revolutionary. And especially some of our conservative Roman Catholics that are normally we normally get along pretty well this year, they're kind of cranky, because of all the attention Luther's getting. They're getting a little bit harsh in some of their rhetoric this year. And then Protestant churches, which I don't include Lutherans in that, but let's say Protestant churches like the Reformed churches, the non-denominational churches, Baptist churches, they so much of their self-image is that they are in opposition to the Roman Catholic Church that they certainly do see, Martin Luther as this revolutionary Che Guevara, stick-it-to-the-man figure, and they certainly have a revolutionary view of the Reformation. So what about Lutherans? Well, I think Lutherans share that oftentimes a lot of Lutherans kind of share in that opinion, especially of Martin Luther. I mean, when you think of Luther, you think of the little monk with the big hammer, you think of Here I Stand, and it's kind of a James Dean-ish Luther with a black leather jacket. We like that. I mean, who doesn't like that? I grew up north, and some of you guys that grew up north, you might be able to bear me out on this. But when little boys would play Yankees and Rebels, nobody wanted to be the Yankees, right? Everybody wants to be the Rebel. So we have this kind of romantic issue, this romantic image of Luther, the rebel, and so it's really across the board, from the secular to the church and everything else. So I looked at this question. I'm not going to repeat this talk. I'm not going to repeat the whole talk. I'm just going to give you kind of a summary and then move on from there, because that's what I want to do today, is kind of look beyond the Reformation to today and beyond and so forth. But if you do want to see it, it is on YouTube, which is a real mixed blessing, isn't it? It's nice to be able to go back to that, but right, Miss Grace, when you're on YouTube, when you're being videoed like now, you got to watch your language and, what kind of jokes you make or whatever, but it's still good. It's all good. It keeps us all in line, right? But just to give you kind of a summary, what I did for this talk, I had to kind of think about what do we mean by revolution and what do we mean by Reformation. You have to define your terms very well. But a revolution, in modern America, we use the word revolution as almost like a marketing word. It's like hype. Blue crystals in the tide is revolutionary. Any kind of change in anything is a revolution because it sells. It's sort of like one of those things that when everything's a revolution, then nothing's really a revolution. But I think we overuse the word revolution. A revolution is like a break with the past. A revolution is kind of a repudiation of the past and a desire to go in a completely new direction. That's really what a revolution is. We Americans think of the American Revolution, right? Every 4th of July, and we refer to the War of Independence as the Revolutionary War. But was it really even a revolution? I mean, even politically, it wasn't a revolution. The Americans were not seeking to overthrow Parliament like Guy Fawkes. They weren't seeking to overthrow the king like the Cromwells. They didn't care who was ruling in London. They just wanted to separate themselves from the British Crown and the British Parliament. They seceded from the empire, and life went on as there was really very little change in the life of an average American during the so-called revolution. There was a war, but that was only because the British invaded. But really, I mean, life pretty much went on with the same legislatures and the same taxes pretty much. Not much changed. The way that average people talked to each other in the streets really didn't change after that. Now, as opposed to the French Revolution, which really was a revolution. They cut the king's and the queen's head off. They overthrew the government. They established a republican form of government. And they made vast changes in society. The way individuals greeted each other on the street changed. Their calendar changed. The churches were shut down. The cult of reason replaced Christianity for a brief time in France. The statues were changed out. It was a profound and deep break with the past. I mean, you couldn't even use the same holidays in the calendar. You couldn't use the same days of the week because they wanted to break with the past. And they wanted to go in a completely new direction. That's what a revolution is. And it's so different than the American Revolution, which had continuity politically and in society. So that's kind of what I had to kind of wrestle with in terms of revolution. All right. The other part of the equation was Reformation. And the question that comes to mind is which one, right? Because we're Lutherans, we think of Martin Luther, and that's kind of our heritage, but the Reformation was a lot more complicated. The way I see it, I think there were 3 Reformations, 4 if you count what happened in England, which was really more political than theological, or it was a mix of political and theological. But of course we had the Lutheran Reformation, led by Dr. Luther and Melanchthon and the Wittenberg School. Then there was also the Reformed Reformation, with Zwingli and Calvin, the city of Geneva and so forth. And then you had the Anabaptists, sometimes called the Radical Reformation. And those are very different theological movements. And again, I'm not going to give you the whole talk. I just want to give you the gist of what I was looking at and how I came to the conclusion that I came to. As I said, the Anabaptists on that end of the spectrum, they were the radical Reformation, and I concluded, I mean, they really were revolutionary. They wanted to break with the past. When it comes to how they saw the church, their ecclesiology, completely different than the past. The way they saw the ministry, they had a very functional view of the office of the ministry. The liturgy, they completely gutted it and redid it. That was a revolutionary change. The sacraments, to them the sacraments are not efficacious unto the forgiveness of sins. A great hostility to the past. I mean, iconoclasm, smashing statues, getting rid of the vestments, completely changing the social order. In many cases, the Anabaptists were political revolutionaries as well at that time. They were overthrowing or attempting to overthrow the aristocratic governments that existed in that day. So you have the Anabaptists at that end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum are the Lutherans, the Lutheran Reformation, and it was actually quite conservative. For example, if you want to understand what Lutheranism is, you have to look at the Book of Concord. I mean, those are the definitive documents of what Lutheranism is. All Lutheran churches are under the obligation to norm their doctrine and practice by the Book of Concord. All Lutheran clergy all over the world are under vows to uphold the Book of Concord. I mean, that is what it means to be Lutheran, way more than any relationship with Martin Luther that we may or may not have on this or that or the other. We are the church of the Book of Concord. So how does the Book of Concord begin? It begins with the ecumenical creeds, right? The three ancient creeds of the church. Document number one is the Apostles' Creed. There is no desire to break from the past. There's a desire to build on the past and use the past confession of the Church Catholic as its foundation. And then immediately after the creeds, what do we have? We have the Augsburg Confession. If you haven't read it through, like in one sitting, please do that sometime. It's absolutely remarkable. It's the most remarkable document, I think, that I've ever read historically. It really did change my life. I was a teenager when I read it, and I became a Lutheran because of the Augsburg Confession. But when you read the Augsburg Confession, you realize this is not a revolutionary document. It's been described as ecumenic. It's an attempt to broker peace. It's an attempt to salvage the unity of the church. But yet it is not a wishy-washy document. It's a forceful confession. And it's backed up by the Scriptures. But it builds on the past. It is not a break with the past. To sum up what the Lutheran Reformation was like, I wanted to read just a brief. I'm not going to read you all the stuff I read at my other talk, but there's a couple that are very, very important excerpts from our Book of Concord. This what I'm going to read to you is... It's in a part that I don't really know how to cite. It's sort of at the end of Article 21 and before Article 22. There are these sort of summary statements. So this is from that part. This is about the sum of our doctrine, in which, as can be seen, there is nothing that varies from the Scriptures or from the Church Catholic or from the Church of Rome as known by its writers. This being the case, they judge harshly who insist that our teachers be regarded as heretics, right? We are not heretics. We are Catholic Christians. We've laid it out carefully in the Augsburg Confession. And there's nothing that even varies from the Church of Rome as it is known from its writers, from the fathers, from the writers of the church. That is not the spirit of revolution. That is an extremely conservative statement that cries out for continuity with the ancient church. Here's another one, another excerpt. This is from the conclusion of the Augsburg Confession. In doctrine and ceremonies, nothing has been received on our part against Scripture or the Church Catholic. And again, I think it's important that it says doctrine and ceremonies. The Latin term used there, the word for and, these little things you might think that makes no difference, but even the word and used there, it's ak, it's a little particle. It indicates that doctrine and ceremonies are not this and that. They are one unit. They are together. It's like husband and wife. It's like father and son. These are bonded together. There's no separation between them. Doctrine and ceremonies. There's nothing in the Lutheran churches that is at odds against what we have received from our heritage, from the Church Catholic and from Holy Scripture. So I went through a lot of other passages as well. There are a lot of, some of them are kind of amusing if you look at the tone, the tenor of them. For instance, anytime, and I had to laugh because Fritz said something yesterday, Dr. Eckhart said something yesterday about doing something new, and Lutherans don't like new. When you read the Book of Concord, the word innovation, the word novelty, those words are treated like, they're profanity almost. They are just, it's like the fact that we're accused of being revolutionary is offensive to the reformers. Shocking, offensive, and they fight and they punch back to tell you, we are not revolutionaries, we are not radicals, we are Catholic Christians, we believe in continuity, we are conservative. And actually, I'm going to talk about being conservative and so forth, because I think that, well, I'll let you know when I get there, okay? But That leaves us to the Reformed. The Reformed are kind of halfway between Lutherans and the Anabaptists. Actually, not even halfway. They are closer to Lutherans. Mostly they are not revolutionary. They do see themselves in continuity with the church. They're not part of the radical Reformation. However, on sacraments, they are revolutionary because they do break with the established church doctrine and the scriptural view of the efficacy of the sacraments, especially, of course, we're talking about Holy Baptism and Holy Communion and the presence in Holy Communion. So they are not overwhelmingly revolutionary, but they have some revolutionary stuff in there that we Lutherans don't have. We just don't have that revolutionary stuff in our Reformation. So you see the complication of the question, is the Reformation a revolution? Well, you have to really narrow it down. But as Lutherans, I mean, this is the one we're concerned about, right? We care about the Lutheran Reformation. I came to the conclusion that the Lutheran Reformation was not in any way, shape, or form revolutionary. And in fact, it was very conservative. And there's a famous tome written by, now I'm drawing a blank, who's the author of the Conservative Reformation? Krauth, Charles Porterfield Krauth. What year was that? 1880s, something like that. Wrote this fantastic sort of introspective on what it means to be Lutheran, and he chose as his title the Conservative Reformation. Because again, we are conservative. Another thing to keep in mind, the Book of Concord, when you read it, it's filled with references to canon law, to the actions and decisions of early popes, early councils. It is and in fact, there's a section in the Book of Concord. It's technically not part of the confessional documents we subscribe to, but there's a document, it's very interesting, it's usually published in your Book of Concord, called the Catalog of Testimonies. And what this is, these are quotes from the very early church fathers. And you know, why did they do that? They were being accused of being revolutionary. They were being lumped in with the Anabaptists. And so they quoted the early church fathers, again, to reiterate and drive home the point that we are not revolutionaries. We are Catholic Christians in continuity with the ancient church, and we're not interested in changing stuff that would, in a way that would betray our past. We're not changing our past like the French revolutionaries. We're preserving our past and building on that foundation of the ancient church. Let's see. Yeah, and in a sense, if you think about it, the central argument of the Reformation, it boiled down to justification. You know, how is the sinner made righteous? Well, we're not reinventing the wheel on that. Where did we hear this? Where did this discussion come up before? Augustine and Pelagius, right? That discussion happened 1,000 years before the Reformation. And which side did the Roman Catholic Church come down on that in that debate? They sided with St. Augustine, right? They sided with Luther, right? They sided with Augustine that God's grace is monergistic. It's a one-way street. God does the work, and we reap the benefit of that. We're not saved by works, but by grace through faith. That was Augustinian Catholicism. And of course, Luther belonged to a religious order that was, who was their patron? He was an Augustinian monk. And so Luther and the early Lutherans, and by the way, the name Lutheran was put upon us. We didn't choose that. The Lutherans didn't choose it. It was a trick, actually, to make us look like heretics, right? Because if you're identified with a man, you can't be part of the broader Church Catholic. You're an Arian, or you're a Valentinian, or you're a Montanist. You're a Lutheran. That name was put on us. We didn't choose it. Just another thing to keep in mind about kind of our self-awareness, or the way we confess what we believe and who we are. So kind of, if you think about it, we want to go back to an earlier version of Catholicism. I mean, that's really what Lutheranism is. It's an attempt to go back to this monergistic, grace-filled Augustinian Catholicism, and even earlier than Augustine, before we had The papacy became very powerful around the time of Gregory, around the time of 600 or so. The papacy began to get more and more powerful. We're trying to, what I'm getting at is that we Lutherans, instead of looking to get rid of our past and go to a radical new future, a new direction, what are we doing? We're reclaiming our past. We're reclaiming the ancient church. And that brought me to further reflection on what are we as Lutherans? I mean, we're not revolutionaries, so what are we? I mean, we're conservatives, yeah, but there's something more here. And when I first started studying history, they used to use, I don't know if they still do or not, probably not. Everything's all identity politics now. But there were kind of four broad categories I was taught to look at when you look at history. If you want to sort of categorize stuff, sort of a taxonomy to get your head around movements in history. You have conservative and you have liberal. First of all, those two. You know, conservatives, again, respect the past and they want to stay on track. They want to preserve and conserve. That's what conservare means in Latin. They want to preserve the direction that we're going and in continuity with the past. Liberals, on the other hand, they may have respect for the past, but they think that we're going in the wrong direction. And so liberalism is about change and about progress, progressivism, the idea that we're going to change things and make things better. So you have conservative movements and you have liberal movements that seek to change the way things are, all right? But then there are two more terms that I think are very, very helpful. Sometimes there are movements that go beyond liberalism. Right? Liberalism says, okay, it's broke, let's fix it. We respect our past, but we're going to make some changes and go in a different direction. But what if you believe your direction was wrong from the beginning? Right? That's a different thing. That's called radicalism. So you have conservative, liberal, and radical was another way of looking at it. A radical says, we're going to tear it up by the roots. That's what it means in Latin. A radical means it means pertaining to the root. So, you know, like for instance, you had in history and economics, you have conservatives, and then you have you have liberals. But then, you know, with Karl Marx, you have these radicals. They want to completely reorder the whole social, political, philosophical system. They're radical, right? So if you think about it, radicals are kind of like liberals on steroids. You know, they don't want to just change direction. They want to move the whole track and rip it up, you know? So where do Lutherans fit in? Well, there's one more. There's one more. Just like we have a term, radical is liberals on steroids. What are conservatives on steroids? Well, that's called reactionary. A reactionary is a historical movement where you believe you're on the wrong track now because the liberals have changed it, or some liberal ideas have changed things, and now you got to get back to where it was before. So the reactionary kind of wants to go back, right? Which is anathema when you live in a progressive worldview like we do. We live in a time, change is good, right? Change is good. Change is part of life. We need to change. Well, a reactionary says we need to go back to the way it used to be, right? A reactionary says, I'm wandering around in the woods and I'm lost. So maybe I should go back, find out where I made my wrong turn, and then go the right way. So it's a conservatism that seeks to go back to sort of an earlier conservatism in order to be on the right track. That's what reactionary is. And it's got a bad name, doesn't it? I mean, when people talk about these are reactionaries, they want to turn back the clock. Yeah, that's what Lutheranism is. We're going to turn back the clock. We are going to turn back the clock on Catholicism before all of this idolatry and praying to the saints and a misunderstanding of the Mass and this idea of purgatory, this monstrously powerful and crooked papacy, and these hierarchs in the church that have turned us into a political entity, and worst of all, the obscuration of the gospel. We're going to go back to an earlier kind of Catholicism. So Lutheranism is not only not revolutionary, it is anti-revolutionary. I mean, we're like the anti-revolutionary groups. We are the reactionaries. And again, this sort of flies in the face of what everybody thinks, what we are, even most Lutherans. most Lutherans would deny that we are reactionary. They would say that we changed, I've heard people talk about this. Luther started his own church. The Catholicism is a different religion. Well, where do you think Luther was baptized and ordained? I mean, for crying out loud. So I just think that is a helpful mental image to our Lutheran identity, that we are reactionary, and any changes that we make are designed to put us on the right track, not change for change's sake, not change so that we look like somebody else, not change to sort of appease people and try to, trick them to come to our churches. When we change things, we don't believe in radical change. We believe in reactionary change. I know there's this group called Radical Lutherans. I don't really know anything about them, but I don't like that term radical, because we're not radical. We're reactionary. Maybe we need to start a group called Reactionary Lutherans. That would really upset a few people, I think. But anyway, so that's that was kind of the conclusion that I came in my last talk about who we are as Lutherans and what the Reformation was and is. And it's complicated because there were elements of the Reformation that were revolutionary. But now let's fast forward to today, okay? Because we had the 1500s, we had our reactionary Lutheran fathers, but today, we've had revolutions in churches that have the name Lutheran. And there have been revolutionary happenings and changes in our past that brought us to where we are today. Like, for instance, the movements of rationalism. We were talking about this a little bit last night with the Enlightenment and Kant and some of these philosophers. Rationalism began to, for instance, the higher critical method of reading Scripture is rooted in rationalism. And unfortunately, guess who gave the world this abominable way of reading the Scriptures? They were Lutherans, They were German Lutherans, Enlightenment-era German Lutherans that began to break with the past in how they interpreted Scripture. Hermeneutically, they were revolutionaries. They began to read and interpret and understand the Scriptures differently than any other Christians in the past.
I think it's wonderful so far what you've given, Larry. That's absolutely great. This idea of progressivism that exists both in, we'll say, the liberal and the radicalism. So it's measured. But I see Lutheranism, even historically, and you come to that point too, is where it's been unfortunately divided in those particular camps. I suppose you're going that direction right now, because when you start looking at Bultmann and you start looking at Kant and all those who have had that effect, it just, because they're definitely not in our reactionary camp whatsoever, and yet they're Lutheran.
Well, there's this dissonance. Again, if you want to know what it means to be Lutheran, you don't have to get this big triglotta. This is 3 languages. You can get that in English. It's a third of the size. It's not that big of a book. The Book of Concord, every Lutheran needs to read it from cover to cover if you can. And our synod and our publishing house, CPH, has put out a wonderful reader's edition, which is fantastic. You don't have to be able to read Greek and Hebrew and Latin and German. You can, there are footnotes, there are explanations, annotations for any, any Lutheran can pick up the Book of Concord and read it and understand it. And that really will shape your view of what it means to be Lutheran. Without the Book of Concord, we don't have an anchor. We're just going to do what other churches are going to do, or do what other businesses are going to do, or do what's successful and copy it with no anchor. We have to be anchored to our faith, because that's what ties us to the apostles and to Jesus himself. Yes?
Instead of the word reactionary, which has some rather negative connotations in some places, how about restorationist?
Yeah, it's a concept. The label is not so important. But with restorationist, I would be a little concerned, because there are some Reformed groups that use that term, and they are of the opinion that we should go back to enforcing the Old Testament laws in the state. So I'm not one of those guys. No, but I see what you're saying. But you know, it's funny with terms. Sometimes what you have to do is just reclaim them and use them. It's like the term Catholic. You know, a Catholic does not mean Roman Catholic. It means according to the whole. It means wholesome. It means orthodox. It means exactly what we are as Lutherans. And, you know, we say it in the Athanasian Creed. We kind of compromise. We say it in the Athanasian Creed, and we kind of shun it in the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed. And really that's a linguistic thing, because the Germans, when the creeds were translated into German 100 years before Luther, they did not have the word Catholic in their lexicon. So they used the word Christian, and then, so, but the point is that I think we need to reclaim terms. You know, we shouldn't allow our opponents to dictate the terms, the terminology. When you do that, you're kind of it's like, you know, we're fighting this battle over political correctness in our culture today. And, you know, you get used to using one word, and then you're told, well, no, you can't use that word. And then we all slink off and we say, okay, well, I'm a cisgender male or whatever. And then they tell us, well, you can't use that word now either. You know what? I'm a man, I am male, I'm masculine, and you know what? Let's just deal with it. I mean, you know, we're Lutherans, we're Christians, you know, we're Catholic Christians. So, I mean, I'm a kind of a fan of just using the word. And if the word is reactionary, then we'll use it. But again, the concept is really the more important thing. The idea that we are not revolutionaries. You know, we're not going to put on our Che Guevara shirts and, you know, raise our fists. We're not that kind of Christian. It's like the Hans Feeney video, right? I am not that kind of Lutheran. If you've seen the Lutheran satire videos, you know what I'm talking about. But yeah, I appreciate what you're saying, because sometimes it is difficult to get through to people. But fortunately, I think most people nowadays are so unfamiliar with the term reactionary. I think we can probably use it without a lot of problems. But we are, you know, when people say, well, you're trying to turn back the clock, well, I mean, it's a loaded term, but in a sense, it is true. We respect the past. We are rooted in the past. We don't want to change the past. Our doctrine and ceremonies are unchangeable and unchanging, right? You know, we can translate into new languages and so forth, but we are not interested in radical change. That is just un-Lutheran. It is outside of the spirit and the letter of the Book of Concord. So, yeah.
Yeah, and with that, and maybe you mentioned that in your paper, but even the Saxon Lutherans who came over here and helped found the Missouri Synod were called, as a term of derision, Old Lutherans, because they weren't with the progressives and the liberals in the early 1800s, late 1700s, and while they were a bit pietistic, because that was the reaction against the rationalists, were the pietists, but the Old Lutherans were there desiring to go back to the time of the Formula of Concord. And that was almost unknown. They had to leave Germany to try to do that somewhere where they wouldn't be messed with. And, you know, we hear that term Old Lutheran, and we say, well, that's bad. Anything old is bad, young is good. And I think we should reclaim that, Old Lutheran.
And I think isn't there a T-shirt company that is called Old Lutheran or something?
T-shirt.
You have one?
My mother gave me a T-shirt. It's called Genuine. It says Genuine Antique Lutheran. Been there, done that, still praying.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned pietism, because you've given me a segue. You know, we had the rationalism, which led to the higher critical method, and then we had the movement of pietism, which led to sort of a de-emphasis of the sacraments, if you will, sort of an introduction of looking at the faith not in terms of confession but rather emotion, and that sort of attacked both the doctrine and the ceremonies of the church. If you've read the wonderful book The Hammer of God by Bishop Boyerts, especially in the first novella, there are 3 novellas, but really in all of them, you see the way that rationalism and pietism wrought havoc on the Lutheran people of Sweden. And it made it very difficult for pastors to give pastoral care. And in fact, the pastors themselves were corrupted by it. So, it led to a lot of things like when you de-emphasize the sacraments, it's going to affect how often you have the sacrament of the altar, for instance. So thanks to pietism, we have generations of Lutherans being starved of the holy body and blood of Christ, breaking from the past tradition. I'm going to talk a little bit about that too in a little bit. But that's those movements became little mini revolutions within Lutheranism. And that's why, for instance, Lutheranism, as it's practiced in the United States, looks quite different than what it looks like in the Book of Concord. Like I said, I was a teenager when I became a Lutheran. I was 18 when I was baptized. When I was 17, I won't give you my whole life story. I was a Baptist. I don't do the testimony anymore. I'm trying to grow out of that, right, Fritz? We're recovering fundamentalists.
A Baptist, always a Baptist.
Yeah, I suppose so. But the point is that, I went to a Catholic high school, Roman Catholic high school, run by the Jesuits. I learned church history. I became intrigued by the Reformation and by Lutheranism. I showed up at the local Lutheran church, which happened to be a Missouri Synod church. I'm 17 years old. I show up. I asked the pastor, what do Lutherans believe? He gave me the Augsburg Confession and the Small Catechism. And then I read this and I thought, wow, this is really awesome. And I started coming to church and I found out, I'm the only one crossing myself here. But it says in the Small Catechism to do this. It says in the hymnal, the Lutheran hymnal. I read the rubrics, you kind of look around in a lot of our Lutheran churches. They don't look like reactionary churches. They don't look like a church that would make that statement that there's nothing in our doctrine or ceremonies that we've received contrary to the Church Catholic, the Scriptures, and even the Church of Rome is known by its writers. There's this dissonance between the reality and the confession. And that's not healthy to have that kind of dissonance, right? If we are going to be true to ourselves, true to our confession, we need to embrace that. And that's what I think anyway. But anyway, I want to run down a couple more of these revolutionary things. How am I doing on time?
You got half an hour at least.
Okay, good. I'm good. Thank you. Here's a big revolutionary thing that happened. And again, largely brought to the Christian world by means of churches that bear the name Lutheran, unfortunately. Women's ordination, right? Women's ordination and also the whole gender question that we're seeing in our culture now, they're really related to each other. But women's ordination was a radical departure from the doctrine and practice of the church of the past, not only from the Scriptures, but from the Church Catholic and from the Church of Rome, known from its writers. It began in Church of Sweden began to ordain. I say ordain in quotes because I don't believe they're actually ordained. I think they're play acting. I don't think it's ontologically possible for a woman to be in the office of the holy ministry. But they began this practice in the 1950s. Think about that, 20 centuries into Christendom, and they start doing this, right? And I want to say that it's not just, it is a heresy. Churches that are led by a woman in this claiming to be in the holy office, it's not Christian. It's outside. It's extra ecclesiam. It's outside of the church. And here's, I'll give you a quick analysis of why. I mean, there are many reasons why. Women's ordination is predicated upon the belief that there's been an injustice, right? It's not, it's that we were wrong to ordain only men. And so we're going to correct this injustice by allowing women to serve, right? That's where it's, well, if it's wrong now, then it was wrong 500 years ago during the Reformation, wasn't it? Right? It was, if it's unjust now, it was unjust then. And it was unjust 1,000 years ago. And it was unjust in the year 100 when the last apostles were around. And it was unjust when the apostles ordained only men. You see where I'm going with this? Who originated this original injustice? Who's the first one to refuse to ordain women into the ministry? Who ordained the first men into the ministry? Sunday school children, you know the answer.
Jesus.
If you believe that a male-only ministry is injustice, then you believe Jesus originated this injustice. And if he sinned in that way, he cannot be the Son of God. Women's ordination is a denial of the Trinity. It's a denial of the divinity of Jesus. It is a heresy. And, it's so sad that people carrying the name Lutheran would bring this demonic doctrine into the churches and to pervert the faith for so many faithful people. That is an example of what it means to be revolutionary. And we Lutherans should want nothing to do with that. In fact, it goes even further. In the Old Testament, the people of God, Israel, they're called a holy people because they're different. They're set apart from the rest of the world. All of their neighbors worshipped many gods. They had polytheism. They had gods and goddesses. And that meant they had priests and priestesses. But the Israelites were weird. Their neighbors thought they were weird. Why? They worshiped one God. And this God came to them and described himself in masculine terms. And what were their clergy? Their priesthood was all male. They did not have priestesses. The whole point of priests and priestesses is that they sort of image the deity. And so the people of God have only had male clergy. So when people insist on female clergy, what they're doing is they're returning to a paganism, really to the roots of polytheism. I mean, it's that bad of a heresy. And in fact, if you want to see something really interesting, to take it to its logical conclusion, if you go to herchurch.org, you'll see a Lutheran church in San Francisco that not only do they have female clergy, they are lesbian clergy, they pray openly to the goddess. They do a rosary to the goddess. They pray, "Our Mother who art in heaven," right? Look, that's not just an opinion. That's not just a difference of opinion. That's heresy. That's idolatry. That's demonic. Yeah, Fritz.
Yeah, I was thinking of a matter of casuistry that you might want to comment on. And it's something that I don't think we have adequately handled in our church body. And that is the question that, it seems to me that we just ignore this. The fact that we have people coming into our church in increasing numbers who had been baptized by women pastors. What do we do about that?
Yeah, that is...
I'm not so sure I know the answer, but it seems to me there ought to be a rite or something.
I think it's just called baptism. Yeah, I just assume they're not baptized. In the same way, Mormons apply water in the name of the Trinity, but we don't recognize what they do as Christian baptism.
No, I'm even talking about like a Methodist.
Oh, I know, I understand, yeah.
Who's baptized by a woman pastor.
Yeah, I just baptize people in that case. Yeah, I don't think we can possibly recognize.
Cannot say that they are not, but for their personal certainty, you baptize.
I would say they're not, but that's just me.
Well, I don't know, but I guess.
Well, and
who would ask you by what authority?
Well, there was a really good article. I don't have the site for it, but you can look it up in CTQ. Scare and Weinrich and Wenthe. There was a debate going on with St. Louis about this issue, and basically, in a nutshell, Scare's argument is baptism happens in Christian churches, and if you have a woman pastor, that's extra ecclesiam. Just like the Mormons, you have Mormons who will apply water in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but that's not a baptism. Or Jehovah's Witnesses do it too, but they mean something different when they say son. I mean, that's just how I would do it as a matter of casuistry. I know that there's debate on it, though. I certainly, yeah.
What about a good Lutheran confessional nurse who does an emergency baptism? Well, I understand the circumstance is different, but by saying, I like his response better. For their certainty, have them, rebaptize them.
Yeah, our organist had that very thing happen. Her granddaughter was born, and they had to airlift her out because they thought they didn't know she was going to make it as soon as she was born. And our lady organist, baptized her own granddaughter, who has happily survived and thriving, and she's a big, beautiful, she's a little girl, but she's like growing up now, and she's wonderful, and she's Roman Catholic, actually. So and that's emergency baptism is a very different thing. That's within the church. But, a lady pastor, I see a lady pastor as being an expression of neo-paganism. So I would say, the way I look at it as a pastor, I look at it the same way as a Jehovah's Witness baptism, because I don't think the confession of the Trinity is there, and I think it's outside of I think it's a pagan practice. So, but I mean, I know that there are people that differ on it, but that's how I would.
The idea of the validity of the word, you being a complete unbeliever as you are, of course, and you consecrate the elements for the body that is before you. Do they eat and drink the body and blood of Christ?
Well, I mean, we're talking about the office. We're talking about a person being in the office.
Still talking about authority. This is an authority issue.
It's an authority issue, yeah. Yeah, sure.
And it goes back to the garden event. The very thing you're talking about is the woman in rebellion in the garden. The pastor had instructed her, and she says, no, I'm going to go my way, not your way or God's way. And so we have the deception that takes place.
And I think you're right on it, because, I mean, feminism is, certainly we don't want women to be mistreated or being treated less than human, all of that sort of thing. There's that kind of feminism. But there's a different kind of feminism that we have today that really does hearken back to a rebellion against, again, it's revolutionary. It's a rebellion against the order that God established between men and women. And I think the women's ordination is a manifestation of that.
It's revolutionary.
It's revolutionary.
True usurpation of the authority of God.
Right.
Every sin begins with that.
It comes from that. This is the thing. It's kind of like Dr. Eckhart's example, a more mild example, but an example nonetheless, where he said there was a pastor who just on the spur of the moment decided to have the whole congregation say the words of institution together. If you do liturgical spontaneity like that, you don't know what the effect is going to be. Now, what if you were brought up in that and you said, I think that's really cute. I like how they did that. And then you become a pastor and you start to insist on that. Before you know it, it changes the theology, because the practice and the theology go hand in hand, right? Lex orandi, lex credendi. The way you worship affects the way you believe. The way you believe affects the way you worship. And if you make a radical departure in doctrine and in ceremonies, it's gonna manifest itself in a change in doctrine. This is why I'm not a believer in this business that you can, as long as you have the right doctrine, you can worship any way you want. I've had this argument with countless times. We teach our kids the small catechism. So we have rock and roll and dancing girls and balloons and clowns and all kinds of stuff, but we teach the small catechism. I'll give you a little anecdote. I was a teacher in a Lutheran high school, and we had this very, very bright girl. She was one of my few students who read absolutely everything in religion class, and she was brilliant, and she was a Lutheran. But I was shocked when we got to the discussion about the sacrament. She didn't understand that we taught the real presence. She said, I thought that was a Roman Catholic thing. I thought we Lutherans believe they symbolize the body and blood of Jesus. Like I said, this is a girl, lifelong Lutheran, confirmed, and she was very intelligent theologically. But her congregation, and I know her pastor, I know there is no way her pastor told her that, right? But she worshiped in a church that worshiped in the gymnasium with a rollaway altar, okay? Actions speak louder than words sometimes. What I mean by that is, as psychologists teach us, that 80% of human communication is nonverbal. So if I'm telling you, oh, this is truly the body and blood of Christ, okay, roll it out. Now let's bring in the volleyball court, and the surroundings confess something, and that's what people remember. So the words are important. Don't get me wrong. We have to speak the right words and confess the right doctrine. But we should do it in such a way, that's why we have rubrics, that's why we have the liturgy, that's why our confessors say the number one purpose of ceremonies is to teach the people what they need to know about Christ. Our kids need to know that Jesus is present in the body and blood for the forgiveness of sins and everlasting life. They need to know that. And so our church architecture needs to scream that. Our vestments, our ceremony, the way you conduct yourselves, especially as pastors, I think Fritz made a great argument for that. Just the way you hold yourself around the holy elements and around the holy places, that conveys reality, especially to young people. They see what you're doing. You know, if the sacrament is right here on the table and you're kind of leaning against it and, you know, and you're in your sandals and you're, you know, what does that convey? That says that's ordinary bread and wine, nothing more, nothing less. So, but if you actually treat it the way that you believe that it is, that communicates the reality of what we believe. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Randall brought something up yesterday when I started going through some of the rubrics about, well, do you have to do these things this way? And what I failed to mention and should probably add is that the overarching rubric is simply be reverent. And that just sort of covers everything.
That's Larry's emphasis too, right? Because there are various forms of extolation.
Absolutely.
Various types of people and how you communicate Christ.
Yeah, that's to add. You have to pretend like God is really there.
Yeah. Well, I'm reminded of Pastor Leidick. Pastor Leidick. Many of you know Pastor Leidick. Wonderful guy, faithful pastor. He used to be a Secret Service guy, and he was telling about a story. They were in the Oval Office. They had some guests, and some lady was sitting in President Nixon's chair in the Oval Office, because, you know, it's cool. It's like, I've never been to the White House, but I did that when I went to the International Center. I sat in Harrison's chair and got my picture, you know. So people were doing that with and in walks President Nixon. Everybody stood up, and they're kind of terrified, and he was good-natured about the whole thing. But, you know, just the fact that he walked in, and they all, you know, snapped to attention. Well, what if Jesus were to walk into your church? You know? I mean, yeah, well, he's up in heaven. He's safely at the right hand of the Father. We don't have to worry about that. Everybody look busy. The boss is here, right? So if you truly believe that Jesus is physically present, the creator of the universe, Almighty God, he's physically here with us, isn't that going to affect your behavior in the chancel, in the sanctuary? You know, I mean, it should, and again, it conveys something. If somebody comes in off the street, they ought to know, if they're watching the divine service, they should know that there is a difference between a Lutheran church and a Baptist church in what we confess about the sacrament. If they can't tell by watching, that's a big problem, right? Because again, 80% of communication is nonverbal. And again, we don't have to reinvent the past. You know, we have historic rubrics. We have teachers from the past. We have the church fathers, the liturgy. I mean, that's what the word tradition means, by the way. Tradition means a handing on, like a relay runner with a baton. That's what tradition is. It's a handing over. So we don't have to reinvent anything. We just have to do what our forefathers did. And quit trying to monkey with it. Because the first time you start trying to do that, now you're creating an alternative tradition, because someone's going to follow in your train. You change one thing in the liturgy, someone else is going to copy it, because that's the way Pastor Schmidt did it when I was a kid. And then everybody's going to do it the same way. And now what do you have in American Lutheranism? You have chaos. Well, yeah, I mean, I agree. Having that many divine services in the hymnal, and I understand why that was. It was kind of a political compromise in order to get the new hymnal. I'm glad we have the new hymnal. But it is sad that, our ancestors, our forefathers, did some dumb things, and we're paying a price now. Well, maybe we shouldn't do dumb things so that our descendants don't have to pay the price. But back to the women's ordination. Am I still okay on time?
You're good.
We're kind of doing Q&A now. That's good. And that's fine. Yeah, just interrupt me if you want.
Another 25 minutes or so.
Okay, I think I'm good. And if I run out of time, oh well. Well, and the women's ordination, it's easy for us to say, well, we don't do that in the Missouri Synod. Okay, we pat ourselves on the back and we're triumphalistic about it. But look how long it took to remove Dr. Becker from the clergy roster. He was openly teaching women's ordination for years and years to young people, young Lutherans, and nothing happened to him until, very recently. Well, the pastor who confirmed me went on to become a district president, and he was openly endorsing women's ordination in his writing, in petitioning the synod, and he's retired now, but even to this day, he's on the clergy roster of the Missouri Synod, and he's still agitating for women's ordination. I mean, fortunately, that faction, there's a demographic going on. I think you all know what I mean. Kind of the radical 60s generation who were in power in the church for a long, long time. They're starting to sort of decline. Time has its toll. But there are still voices calling for these radical kinds of things. Well, at the convention, the last district convention, I think it was the last one. I don't know. It was the last one I was at. I think it was the last one. I don't remember. I have a bad memory. It's one of the advantages of getting older. You don't have to be as precise because you don't remember stuff. But there was a lady delegate. We were discussing our relationship with with a church that the synod's not in fellowship with, but our district had a relationship with, and they ordain women. And there was a discussion about that. And a lady delegate stood up and said, well, just because they ordain women, that shouldn't impede fellowship. I mean, they just happen to do it, and we just happen to not do it. So it's not really that. I don't see why that's a big deal. And she sat down, and no one corrected her. That's not a preference issue. That's a biblical issue. And so we shouldn't be too triumphalistic about all of this. The Lutheran Church of Australia, just a couple years ago, their convention voted in a majority to ordain women, but they lacked the supermajority needed to carry the vote. And this is a confessional church body. This is a church body that had Kurt Marquardt and Herman Sassa teaching there, and Dr. Lockwood. And we're not in fellowship with them, but they are generally seen as a confessional Lutheran body. And they've also had some recent articles about homosexuality as well, that they're going pretty wobbly on all of those issues. These are revolutionary things that have happened in the church. And I want to shift directions a little bit. I'm going to step on a few toes maybe in the Missouri Synod here. Because again, we can talk about women's ordination and say, oh, those bad ELCA Lutherans, without getting our own hands dirty too much. But I mean, we've had revolutionary practices in our own past that affect our own doctrine and practice. So I'm going to give a disclaimer. We're all Americans living in the 21st century with the consequences of things that have been done in the past. So if I say something that your church does, my church does some of these things. And as a pastor, I oversee some of these things. I'm not scolding anybody. I'm not saying you're a bad pastor or you're a bad congregation. I'm just pointing out where we are, where we have deviated from our conservative trajectory laid out by the reformers. And we need to keep these things in mind. It doesn't mean we change things overnight. It doesn't mean we go in like a bowling ball in a china shop. But it means we need to be honest with ourselves and assess where we are for the sake of our descendants who are going to come after us. Okay? We need to, as reactionary Lutherans, we need to think about getting back on the right track. And sometimes it's a very long-term, process. But so that's my disclaimer. So don't anyone get offended or anything. But like for instance with liturgical matters, that is a big issue in the Missouri Synod, right? Again, we have this vast range of liturgical practice, and fortunately, our forebears in the Synod have given us Article 24 in the Augsburg Confession and in the Apology of the Augsburg Confession, which is a further explication of the Augsburg Confession. So here's Here's the very beginning of Article 24 from the Apology. Now listen to this. This is from our Book of Concord. At the outset, we must again make the preliminary statement that we do not abolish the Mass, but religiously maintain and defend it. For among us, Lutherans, among us, Masses are celebrated every Lord's Day and on the other festivals in which the sacrament is offered to those who wish to use it after they have been examined and absolved. And the usual public ceremonies are observed, the series of lessons, of prayers, vestments, and other like things. All right, that's in our Book of Concord. Our churches are committed to that. Our pastors are committed to that. That's what we believe, teach, and confess. Does that sound revolutionary to anybody in here? Does that sound like it describes the typical Missouri Synod congregation? Do you know of maybe any of our churches that sort of deviate from that? I mean, let's take a little look here. The word Mass, that is the order of Holy Communion as received from the Western Catholic tradition. That's what that is. And so, and in fact, the suggestion to our founders, to the early Lutherans, the suggestion that we don't observe the Mass was offensive to them. It made them angry. When you read Article 24, they're really angry because they're being falsely accused of having abolished the Mass. The radical reformers did that. The Anabaptists did that, but not the Lutherans. In fact, we keep it better than our opponents, says our confession. Every Lord's Day, what does that mean? Every Sunday what?
Communion.
Every Sunday communion, right? There's nothing more frustrating to me. When I'm out of town, I remember after Hurricane Katrina, I was a hurricane refugee. My family and I, we didn't know if we had a house anymore. We fled to Little Rock, Arkansas. And, there's a church. I'm going to get to hear word and sacrament, take part in the divine service for the first time since this horrific event, right? And I go in, and we were running a little late, so I'm running ahead of my family to talk to the pastor to let him know that I want to take the sacrament. I get in, I'm huffing and puffing, I get into the sacristy, and the pastor says, "Oh, it's okay, it's not a communion Sunday." What do you mean it's not a communion Sunday? According to our Book of Concord, when is a non-communion Sunday? There's no such thing as a non-communion Sunday. And so my family and I were denied the sacrament. Why? Why do we do that? What good does that do any person?
It's 10 minutes short.
So that the other people who didn't go through Hurricane Katrina, I guess, could get earlier reservation at lunch or whatever, kickoff, I don't know. Mostly I think it's a bad habit we've gotten into. I think people in our past, 100 years ago, monkeyed with the liturgy, and and now we're bearing the consequence of that. Other festivals, what is that? Oh, I'm sorry.
I just want to take it a step further because you're being very kind. Because to not celebrate the Lord's Supper on the Lord's Day is sin. We have it in Concord because it's in Scripture. It's not something we invented.
Well, and think about why it's called the Lord's Day, right? The Marys went to the tomb on the first day of the week, on Sunday, and found it empty. And then when did Jesus appear next to the disciples? It was Sunday. And then what happened next Sunday after that? Jesus appeared again. And what happened after that, next Sunday? Jesus made these post-resurrection appearances on Sunday. What day was Pentecost? And when did the apostles gather for the breaking of bread and hymns and prayers?
That started on Easter Sunday, the breaking of the bread.
Yeah, absolutely. We have, again, to break from the tradition of celebrating the sacrament every Sunday is revolutionary. And it's un-Lutheran. And it's spiritually damaging to people. Look at our culture, for crying out loud. Look at the damage that Satan has wrought on our culture. And what are we doing? We're actually planning non-communion Sundays. I mean, I don't get this. Oh, well, it's the second or the fourth Sunday. We don't have communion. We plan not to have communion. Why do we do that? And again, I'm not indicting any pastors or churches, because I know some really, really good pastors that have gotten virtually crucified for going into a congregation and saying, we need to go to every Sunday communion. We're starving to death if we don't get the Holy Sacrament often. I mean, the word often is even in the Lord's words. Why do we do this? We need to have the humility to go back. Let's be reactionary Lutherans. Let's go back to the early church. Let's go back to the Reformation. Let's go back before pietism and rationalism did this to us. Satan did this to us. Well, you know what? And we should work together. Pastors and lay people, we should work together and get back to the salutary practice of taking the sacrament it's right there in black and white in our confessions. Why are we doing this? Can anyone in this room give me one good, godly reason to omit the Holy Sacrament on Sunday?
You don't have a called pastor at your church.
That is a good reason. Yes, you're right about that.
That's the only good reason.
Well, and you know, like our friends in Russia, there are no pastors sometimes for 1,000 miles. So they have to wait. Or I have a colleague in Kenya. He has 6 congregations, all right? They're poor. They're very poor. Wine has to be imported into Africa. They can't afford to have the sacrament every Sunday. They have the sacrament every 2 months. But do you think for a moment that this faithful pastor in Kenya would plan, if he had the money, the funds, and the ability to do it, do you think he would ever say, well, we're only going to have communion on the first and third Sundays, because we don't do communion Sundays? I know for a fact he wouldn't. It tears him apart that he cannot give his people the body and blood of Christ every Sunday, and it's because of his poverty. Here we are in America. We're a rich country. Our churches are rich. We have plenty of bread and wine in the sacristy. We've got pastors. And what do? We deliberately omit the Lord's Supper on the second or whatever Sundays. We are deliberately omitting the Lord's Supper. And that is revolutionary. And that's an example of why I say we shouldn't think revolutionary. We should think reactionary. We should think of fidelity to the past and not try to break with the past. Bad things happen when you break from the past, right? Now, some changes are good, right? We have electric lights in our church. We have flush toilets, an air conditioner. Those are all great. But that does not change the doctrine and ceremonies of the church, right? Those are good changes. And even, changing in terms of going from German to English and all of that, I mean, that's good. But the point is that what confesses Christ and how we receive the gifts, that should never change. That should never change. All right, so there's that.
Before you get off of that subject, you addressed the first half of the "and" clause.
What's that?
You addressed the first half of the "and" clause every Sunday.
Uh-huh.
But it goes on to say, and on the feast days that it's normally observed.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to get to that next. Every Lord's Day, that's another one. So the church ought to have her own calendar. And we as pastors and we as lay people, as Christian people, we live in 2 worlds. We live in the secular world and we live in eternity. We live in the church, we live in the outside reality. But our sense of time ought to be governed by the church and not vice versa. I mean, I know, I'm in New Orleans, and sometimes we have to schedule church events around the LSU football schedule and the New Orleans Saints football schedule. I know up in Wisconsin you have that sort of thing too. Why? Why should Christians put priority on sports, entertainment, or those sorts of things? And I'm guilty of this. If we have a feast day, we won't have a church service on a Monday when there's a feast day. We don't, because I know that we'll show up. It'll be just a handful of people, and so maybe we should, but we don't. But I'm not going to cover it up and say, well, it's a good thing, or we can do. We're just changing with the times. No. We shouldn't be that way. We shouldn't have that attitude. So, yes, and a kind of compromise. I mean, sometimes you have to compromise. What I like to do is if a feast day falls close to the Wednesday, we have Wednesday services, I'll celebrate the feast day on a Wednesday, for instance. But, in Luther's day, church had priority over everything else. And if it was a feast day and it fell on a Monday, then people went to church on Sunday, and then people went to church again on Monday. How about Christmas this year falling on a Sunday? How many churches around the country decided to close? Or again, the Easter thing, when you have Easter and it doesn't fall on a communion Sunday. I know pastors that, they can't have communion on Easter Sunday because it happened to fall on the second or fourth Sunday. I mean, this is preposterous. So Mass, every Lord's Day, other festivals, after everyone is examined and absolved. If someone comes in off the street, how do you know that they've been examined and absolved? How did the early church handle this? Well, they practiced closed communion, okay? And I know this is not a popular subject, but the point is how are we to honor what we confess, that everyone we commune, especially us pastors, because we're stewards of the mysteries, we're the ones held accountable. It's not our elders, it's not our church council, it's not the layperson who's really smart and intelligent. We bear the burden of this before the Lord Jesus Christ. And we've made this confession that when we give Holy Communion to someone, they've been examined and absolved. That means they have been properly catechized. They're in fellowship with us. And so to open the communion to anybody, or to open communion to anyone who believes in the, whatever, I mean, there's all these communion statements. These are excuses not to do the right thing. That's revolutionary. The early church did not practice open communion, right? The early Lutherans didn't practice open communion. That's what it means that Luther was excommunicated. That meant he did not celebrate, preach, or participate in the sacrament of the altar in Roman Catholic churches. And it means they don't in ours. And that's nothing to celebrate. That's nothing to be joyful about. It's a sad reality of the sinful division of the church. But it doesn't go away by ignoring it, right? If we can dialogue, if we can mend fences and build bridges, who knows? Maybe 500 years from now, maybe we will have true Christian unity in terms of fellowship. We can't predict the future. Who would have seen the Berlin Wall come down? I mean, change can happen. But it doesn't happen by ignoring the very real differences that we have. Our Book of Concord says we practice closed communion, and that just is what it is. And we can't tap dance around that. If we're going to be authentic, if we're going to be faithful, if we're going to be truly what we say we believe, then that's going to be our practice. It's going to be closed communion. And another thing,
Moments ago, you illustrated very well when you at New Orleans event, and you went up to where it was, and you ran to the church ahead of your family because you wanted to go converse. It's not to announce, no, I'm going to show up at the table today. You don't announce for communion. That isn't what it is. There must be a conversation. The conversation involves the very thing you're talking about, to confess. Yeah. Now, when somebody does come to sanctuary for that gift, and they're able to come to you and confess, even that's why they must see the pastor before that communing practice. Or as you say, many congregations have that statement, we take people at their word. That's what we are called to do.
Sure, absolutely. You can't see into people's hearts, You
don't turn everybody away. What's your confession? Oh, you're a member of an evangelical Lutheran church in America. Then we can apologize, explain, and sorry, we'd like to talk to you more afterwards or whatever.
And it should be done with pastoral sensitivity. You shouldn't be a jerk about it. You should never be a jerk about it. But we are called to be firm about this. Yes.
I was just going to say, building on that, and your statement with 1 Corinthians 4, that it's not only a conversation, but it's actually, anytime we're visiting, I ask permission. I don't expect that it's my right to receive, the body and blood of Christ. I ask permission because the celebrant is the steward, right?
You're confessing the faith when you go converse. As I say, you have anyone that goes to appeal to the authority of the keys, the amt in that place.
Mm-hmm.
I just always ask people, I flip it on them. I ask them if they could return to their church faithfully and faithfully commune back at their Episcopalian church or Presbyterian church, knowing what we believe, teach, and confess. Can you faithfully go back?
Well, and like Roman Catholics, for instance, if you're Roman Catholic and you commune at a Lutheran altar, technically, according to Roman Catholic canon law, you are excommunicating yourself from Rome. And so a lot of good Catholics, they don't intend to do that, but you can ask them, you can say, are you converting to Lutheranism? Because according to the canon law of the Roman Catholic Church, if you take communion, you are repudiating the Pope. And they'll say, oh, no. Okay. But, when people come to the rail, and if I have a brief conversation with them, and what I do is I tell them, welcome, may I give you a blessing? And I give them a blessing. But I tell them they're welcome. I don't tell them, well, you're a heathen, go away. I mean, we want people to come, but we are bound as stewards of the mysteries to be responsible and to abide by the confession of the church.
Being a layman, I'm not as well read, so I might be
probably better read than many of us. Don't sell yourself short.
Standing, and in the early church, if you were going to travel, you went with a letter of introduction from yours. You just didn't go talk and say, oh yeah, I went. You went with a letter of introduction. As a church, the modern equivalent I think we should be doing is issuing photo IDs. And you're supposed to wear your photo ID up to the altar.
With a little scanner, right? Well, I wouldn't go that far, but I mean, being a member of the Missouri Synod it means that you're part of a fellowship of churches. It's not just here, it's around the world. So when I go to Novosibirsk, I can kneel at St. Andrew's Lutheran Church, and I can take the Holy Sacrament there because the bishop knows that his church body is in fellowship with our church body. And that's what, these theological discussions go on before we declare a state of fellowship. And so we want to make sure that we believe the same stuff. It's not for the purpose of exclusion, it's for the purpose of being faithful. Yeah.
Just real quick, just building on, for me, a helpful practice has been, because, and Pastor Busman just mentioned to me that he was talking about the card thing, and you swipe and it tells whether or not they're in good standing or whatever. But I think a member in good standing is important because someone can sort of confess and still be living in unrepentant sin or something like that. So one of the things that I've done, if I know that I've got a member that's going to visit a particular congregation, I'll give them a call or send them an email saying, hey, this person's coming, they're a member in good standing. Just wanted to give you a heads up kind of thing, and I think that's been helpful.
This is good churchmanship for the pastors to kind of keep an eye on their flocks and that sort of thing.
Now, unfortunately, this may shock y'all, but some of us laymen actually, before we go to a church to take communion, we'll try to talk to the pastor and find out if he's really confessional because I'm not sure I want to go. And I had an experience with Katrina. I actually went to Pastor Leidick's church, and I didn't recognize the name because I'm awful at names. And we're sitting there along with my brother-in-law, kind of trying to feel him out as to where he is. And then I looked and I said, wait, I know you. Weren't you you used to be in Secret Service? He goes, yeah. He looks at me and says, wait, you're from Metairie. I know you.
Yeah. Well, and it ought to be like that. In a Missouri Synod, you should be able to walk into any church not having to research, okay, are they doing the liturgy or are they doing something totally different? Are they practicing every Sunday communion and closed communion, or are they doing something revolutionary? And again, we are where we are. There are very faithful congregations and pastors that are struggling to get back on the right track, and we should not judge them harshly. And and we should support. And if you are a lay person, and you want your church to be on track, you can really be of huge help to your pastor by being supportive. Go to the voters' meeting, speak up. If you have a newsletter, write something in the newsletter. Talk to the other members about it. Encourage people to read the Book of Concord. But your pastor, he can be the most confessional, faithful Lutheran in the world. But if the church will not, in our polity, it's a democratic polity. If the overwhelming numbers of people in the congregation don't want every Sunday communion, the pastor simply doesn't have the power to enforce it or to implement it or to change it. He's the shepherd, but in our system, in many cases, the sheep oversee the shepherd. And so the shepherd now has to sort of lead in a way of building consensus because that's the polity that we have. But at any rate, lay people have great power in our church to assist in restoring salutary practices in our churches. And it's been going on for a long time. I mean, we've had, in the 20th century, we've seen a resurgence and a restoration of practices that we had lost, quite frankly, from the 1800s. So, and that's an ongoing, long-term reclamation process. It's not going to be, this time next year, you're not going to have all of these aberrations done, and maybe not in any of our lifetimes. But I think we have to adopt a mindset, and that's really my message for you today. We have to adopt a mindset that in our past we've been hijacked, perhaps by well-intentioned people, but there have been little revolutions in our history. And we have to, in order to be faithful, we have to find a way to push back against it. Part of it is catechesis, part of it is liturgy. Liturgy is catechesis, right? And teaching and moving, at a proper pace to bring people, to bring the sheep of our Lord Jesus Christ back into the fold of the confession that we all say we believe in. I mean, nobody thinks we should say we believe in one thing and then do the opposite, right? Like the old Methodist preacher that would smoke cigarettes. Do as I say, don't do as I do. My grandma told me about that. She had a pastor like that. Isn't that great? Do as I say, don't do as I do. All right, so the other thing at the very end of that, that little segment of Article 24 of the Apology, it mentions the ceremonies of the church, the usual order of ceremonies. I think it's the Tappert translation renders that as the traditional forms of worship, like the vestments, the order of the readings of prayers, and the like. Right? If you look at if you have the Reader's Edition of the Book of Concord, and you look at Article 24, there's a handy chart. It shows you the medieval Roman Catholic Mass, the Tridentine Mass on one side, and it shows the Lutheran order of worship on the other side. They're virtually identical. The canon of the Mass was removed, as Dr. Eckhart talked about. There were too many heretical statements in there that could not be reclaimed. That was removed. And the only other thing really that the Lutherans did was they restored. They didn't change. They didn't engage in revolutionary behavior, but they engaged in the reactionary behavior of bringing the sermon back to the liturgy. In the Middle Ages, the sermons were oftentimes just dropped. You didn't have a tradition of preaching. And the Lutherans brought back not just preaching, but gospel preaching, law and gospel, preaching on the text. And look at the ancient fathers. Look at St. John Chrysostom. Look at these brilliant preachers from the early church. So again, there was nothing revolutionary about that. It was a reactionary thing to bring the sermons back. So, but again, you look at all of these revolutionary practices that we have around us. And what do you hear sometimes if a pastor goes to try to go to every Sunday communion, for instance, or to restore some kind of liturgical practice? This is the objection. We've always done it that way, right? And in a sense, that's when you say we've always done it that way, what do you mean by we, and what do you mean by always? And if you think about it that way, if you think that we means the people of God from time immemorial. It means we, the church of the apostles and Jesus. It means the medieval Roman church that's part of our heritage that led that the Reformation, made some corrections to. That's what we mean by we. And when we say always, that's what we mean by always. We have to the church is bigger than me. It's bigger than this group. It's bigger than our congregation. It's bigger than the Missouri Synod. The church is Catholic. It is the wholeness of the church. And we should look at that. We should think of church in those terms. Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
On this we, I'm thinking we can still teach that because we can go to the Athanasian Creed and it still says we. The Nicene, correct me if I'm wrong, shouldn't the Nicene Creed say we?
Originally it did.
Yeah, it should be we, but we've changed it to I. It still should be we.
That's because the we was the bishops assembled. It changed to I for use in the liturgy.
Okay. But with that we...
But there's still there is a collective confession of the church. The Book of Concord is my confession, but it's not just my confession. It's also Dave's confession, right? It's also Grace's confession. It's the church's confession, and we should collectively confess it. We should believe, teach, and confess it and practice it. So, yeah, that's a good point. How much time do I have, guys?
You're about there. Maybe take
I was just going to open up a big can of worms.
take 5 minutes.
All right, we'll open up a big can of worms. And this is a problem, an issue in my congregation. How about this revolutionary practice of swapping out the chalice for the little cups, right? We talked a little bit about this. That was revolutionary. At any point in church history, in the ancient church, did they use individual cups in the Holy Communion, in the East or the West, in the Greek church or the Latin church? Did we see this? We begin to see it in the 20th century. So 20 centuries roll by, and someone said, hey, let's serve the Lord's blood in a little glass, right? And a lot of that was because it was done in Reformed churches. They had gotten rid of the alcohol in the communion, which made it a sanitary issue, so they had to go to little cups. So what do the Lutherans do? The Lutherans come along and say, oh, that looks fun, let's do that, right? There's a shiny thing. Oh, rather than... Well, and I want to talk about that because, part of it is, this is an example of, I think, where rationalism affects the way we see Holy Communion. Which saint called it the medicine of immortality? It wasn't Irenaeus. It was, do you remember? I thought I had it written down here, but Cyprian. I think it was Cyprian. All right. And that's a metaphor. Right? It's a medicine of immortality. But we are a people, we have a lot of medicines today, and we take medicine and it fixes us. And so, like, take penicillin, for instance. I know that I'm probably going to screw this up, Doc, but you'll forgive me, right? He's in the business of medicine and in the business of forgiving. But, okay, let's just roll with me on this metaphor. Okay, you have penicillin. You're sick. You need penicillin. You can take a pill, right? You can probably take a liquid, an oral liquid. You could probably take a hypodermic. There's probably a shot you can get. The point is to get the penicillin in the body. It might even be a suppository. I don't know. The point is to get the stuff in your blood so it can do its work and make you better. I think there's a little part of us that sees Holy Communion like this, right? It doesn't matter how you get it in there. You just got to get it in there. But think about it. Would we ever take consecrated wine and consecrated particles of the host, put it in a hypodermic and inject someone? We wouldn't do that, would we? Because what did Jesus say to do? Eat, drink. What else did Jesus say to do? Yeah. What else did he say to do with the cup? He said, take this, y'all take, it's a plural verb, you take this, singular, cup, singular, all of you, or as we say in the South, all y'all. All of you, and drink from it. I mean, that's the Lord's words. I mean, how much more clear can you get than that? That is Jesus. That's not the Book of Concord. That's not some Gottesdienst article. This is our Lord Jesus Christ is telling us the mode of reception, right? And so I don't think we should gainsay that. I think we should obey what he says to do. I'm not saying it invalidates the sacrament, but I am saying if it was important enough for Jesus, who, at the Last Supper, they all had their own table settings, but Jesus deliberately took one cup and he said, all of you drink from it. Then he's got some reason for it. And again, that's part of being a conservative. It's part of being a reactionary. This is the way we've done it, and we shouldn't change it. Because there were unintended consequences. I'm sure the guy that invented the little cups had the best intentions in the world. But look at what's happened. I know in my church, sometimes I'll walk by and with my chasuble and it'll knock a cup on the ground. And now the Lord's blood is being spilled on the floor where we walk. That was wonderful, wasn't it, that we had that happen? Or little kids come to the altar and they spill it. Why did we do this? I mean, I know there's a fear of germs and all of that, which is a red herring. There's nothing unsanitary about receiving the Lord's blood from a chalice. It's metal. There are antiseptic properties. It's got alcohol in it. You just don't get sick from it. But the point is that we've made this change now. It's been with us for close to a century, and now it's almost impossible to get rid of. It's in my congregation uses them. I've been there 12 years now. And I am nowhere near getting rid of them. I don't touch that one with a 10-foot pole. I mean, I teach. I want people to take the chalice. And what does it confess to? my predecessor used to have the glasses thrown in the garbage with the Lord's blood in them. I was able to change that. But, I mean, what does it say when you serve, like someone, who was it mentioned yesterday, I wouldn't even serve wine. I wouldn't even serve wine at dinner in a little plastic little cup like that or whatever, disposable. If you believe, again, if you believe the King of the universe, the Lord Jesus Christ, God in the living flesh is here, why would you use a disposable, crummy servingware for it? Why would you do that? Again, it's that thinking, well, the method doesn't matter, the blood is what matters. Let me give you another analogy. What about a guy that gives a diamond to his fiancée? He gets a beautiful, let's say, a beautiful 2-carat cut, beautiful, magnificent diamond. Well, the diamond is what's important, right? So it doesn't matter what he puts, what kind of ring he gets for. Plastic? Put it in plastic, right? We wouldn't do that because we believe that the diamond is special and beautiful, and we put it in a beautiful setting that accents it. So the use of the chalice, it doesn't have to be ornate. But when you use a chalice, it sends a strong message to anybody and everybody that's watching. And when we are all drinking out of the same chalice, right, that's an act of brotherhood. I was told where I did my vicarage in the Deep South, and I was told they went to the individual cups during the crisis over desegregation because there were black people and white people that didn't want to drink out of the same cup. What message does it send when everybody kneels at the altar, regardless of rank, regardless of what you do for a living, regardless of how exalted you are, regardless of what color you are, what ethnic background you are all kneeling together and drinking out of the same cup. I mean, come on. That is what Jesus has done for us. And that's important. That's not to be gainsaid. That's not to be just, well, it doesn't matter as long as we can put it in a hypodermic, as long as the people get it. That's not the point. The point is that Jesus established it to be done this way, and we ought to yield to him, shouldn't we? Dave, are you making a toast, or are you raising your hand?
I guess there's no end to what we'll do to stuff that doesn't belong to us. Namely, the Lord's. It's the Lord's stuff. So since it's not ours, we'll do whatever, right? If it was ours, no way, right? At seminary, one of our, I think he was just being provocative. He said, he was teaching about, he just kind of said, oh, come on, guys, you got to be open about communion, blah, blah, blah. But then he told a story about years before he was in charge of the campus at Fort Wayne, who came in and he said, we had visitors coming in there. Can you believe this? And they were fishing in our pond. And he said, and they told them, get out of there. They came back. And so, how disgusting is that? And my friend raised his hand and said, so it's closed pond and open.
We do have a consistency problem. Well, listen, I know my time's up. I just want to wrap this up. I want to repeat, I'm not criticizing any of our fellow pastors or, any of our churches with these practices. I'm just saying let's adopt a mindset, even if it's a long-term mindset, that we need to be in conformity with our confessions because we truly believe them, and we truly believe Jesus is present, and we truly believe that our young people need to be fed with the word and with the sacrament. And let's move together in a loving way, not in a harsh way or an ugly way, but we do need to try to move in that direction. And I think our Lord's advice to be innocent as doves and wise as serpents is called upon. And there's a role for lay people and for clergy to work together. And remember that from our confessions, to teach the people what they need to know of Christ. That is the role of ceremonies. And so it is catechetical. And we need it now more than ever. And that, again, 80% of human communication is nonverbal. So it matters how you hold your hands. It matters how you hold your head. It matters whether, the expression on your face when you are in the chancel. And for lay people, too. Lay people see each other worshiping. And if you're bowing for the Gloria Patri in the pew, if you're folding your hands, if you're reverent, that is also a confession. And believe me, nothing warms a pastor's heart more than to see the lay people reverently participating together in the rubrics of the church. That teaches the young people. They see and they learn. So that's my message to all of you. And I really, really appreciate being here. I appreciate your time. And Thank you once again.
For the sake of truth, you were right to start with your heart. It's Ignatius of Antioch.
Oh, it was Ignatius. Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.